Welcome back to another episode of the EDPS Talks, where together with our guests we explore their unique perspectives on data protection and privacy and how these shape their respective fields. Let me introduce our next speaker for today, Mr. Jan-Philipp Albrecht. Since June 2022, Jan-Philipp Albrecht serves as co-president of the Berlin-based Heinrich Böll Foundation. As a member of the European Parliament, Mr. Albrecht represented the Green Party from 2009 to 2018. And during his tenure, he played a key role in shaping EU data protection laws, including the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which became a global benchmark for privacy legislation. Particularly close to his heart are civil rights in the digital age. Today, Mr. Albrecht will bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to today's discussion. Mr. Albrecht, we are thrilled to have you here with us. Thank you for joining us and welcome to EDPS Talks.
Thank you. I'm happy to be part of it.
Great. Jan, we usually start the interview with a personal question. What does privacy mean to you?
I think privacy in a personal term, firstly means that I don't have to share everything of my personal life, and I can keep different spheres of my personal life. So I have my very close family and friends, which I share a lot with, but I also have people around me I know, which I wouldn't tell everything, and also colleagues at work or the public. And I choose what to share with whom. And I think that's a very normal thing in life. And it's also a requirement for self-determination of my personality. I want to have an influence on how I want to be perceived and which context people know about me regarding personal things. But I also think that there is society dimension behind it. And in this regard, I think that the constitutional principles in Europe, in particular in Germany, the country I grew up and was politically socialized in, brings across the idea of self-determination and human dignity of persons in a digitalized life, which now also is taken on board by many countries in the world, and also in the US, where privacy meant mostly to keep people out of their personal lives, as I mentioned, on a personal level. And this society dimension is there in Europe for a reason, because we have had experiences with surveillance societies, with the effect of being surveyed and not having self-determination in the way of how information about me is being processed. And this dimension is important as part of privacy, as it is a precondition for democratic society and for a society which is built on human rights, also in a digitalized environment.
Well, thank you, Jan. That brings me to my next question. In your contribution to the EDPS's 20th anniversary book, you mentioned at the time that your main objective with the General Data Protection Regulation was to make sure that the fundamental right to data protection had a comprehensive set of rules in order to protect it, but also to create a single market, a digital single market. And you mentioned the informational right to self-determination and the different roles for persons, individuals, and also for society. Obviously, this is where supervisory authorities come in. And I ask you now, considering that it is now the European Commission which holds significant authority over the regulation of digital platforms, particularly under the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. Do you think that it would be beneficial to revisit the concept of a single EU-wide regulator for data protection and privacy?
I think that it was a huge step for the European Union to regulate these questions in form of a regulation and thereby set a single standard and single set of rules for the European market. It was a first step of several steps to be a market in the world which still is able to set standards for the digital market, as the European influence on a global scale is diminishing and many standards came up for the digital markets. And the question was if Europe still can have an influence on the development of standards on this digital global market, or if it in the end has to accept the standards brought up by other regions and regulators of the world. Having said that, I think that we didn't really manage to regulate everything on a single level standard on the European level. There's still a lot of fields of regulation which is very different, which are very different in implementation of the member states. If you look, for example, at the whole e-privacy scheme, so the question of communications privacy, where there is many different implementations, although we have a single internet and a single usage of internet services across the European market, there's no real opportunity of treating it very different. And when we look at the question how communication services treat privacy issues or data protection issues, it's just important to also get into a single standard in this field. And you also have fields like health data, sensitive data in general, the question of employment data protection, or even the protection of personal data in the sector of law enforcement, which are still very differently implemented in Europe. So I think that we should revisit in terms of arriving at an even more harmonized standard level as we have now. And also, I think if we look at the GDPR, it is important to not say that everything is already answered in substance by this regulation. In contrary, the GDPR leaves a lot of flexibility for technological development. And therefore, it's good that we have talks about, or even regulation about artificial intelligence and about many other questions coming up with new technology. But it would also be good to maybe look at the question if there could be even more sophisticated answers in data protection law. For example, we have discussed unified, simply understandable signs and symbols for the communication about my preference in data protection when it comes to digital services. I really think that there could be progress in this regard still in the future to make it more easy to communicate about data protection preferences, and therefore make it easy to implement data protection as a fundamental right. And also, I think that, for example, the question of oversight is still a question we have to look at, as the European Data Protection Board is an important actor now, and it brings more consistency in implementation in the European market, but we also see its weaknesses. And these weaknesses are mainly about the point that there is the possibility, for example, to have majority decisions in the board, and there is the possibility of close cooperation between national DPAs when they investigate. But in the end, they all have their national lenses and also priorities, And I think it makes sense to revisit the question if there shouldn't be a single data protection authority also in Europe, doing at least a huge part of the regulation, which is for the bigger actors and the global market acting on the European market.
Great, Jan. Thank you for that answer. And that fits tightly into my next question, actually, because the new EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has now proposed a European data union strategy in her political guidelines, aiming for a streamlined framework to enhance data sharing across businesses and administrations while maintaining high privacy and security standards. So, Jan, given what you just said, and given that you were indeed one of the fathers of the GDPR, how do you feel about this initiative, and what advice would you offer to the European Commission now to ensure its success and alignment with fundamental privacy rights?
First of all, I think it's a great idea to enhance the possibilities to use data and share data on the European market between different market actors, because we still have an environment in which many actors build some kind of a cartel or also a fence around their data sets and the information they gather by automatization and digitization of our society and by the building of new technologies. It would be a huge step for innovation and common good if these informations could be shared easily between different market actors, and there would be open competition and also interoperability and accessibility when it comes to data. But we also have to see that this is a talk about data in general. And a part of data is personal data. So this differentiation hasn't been made clear enough until today, in my view. There's still a lot of people, even in business and administration, who don't see the fact that data is not always personal data. When I say that my shelf has a white color, then this implies a personal data because it's my shelf. But if I have the information, this shelf is white, that is no personal data. And I think it's important to say we have vast possibilities today, in particular when it comes to machine learning, artificial intelligence, and big data analysis, a vast possibility of vast possibilities to process data on an anonymous basis. And for those data, there need to be as less limits as possible to get them everywhere and to use them for all purposes. But when it is about personal data, we have to see that every sharing of information of personal data, every processing, every storing for every further day is always a possible infringement and a risk for the individual and its personal human rights, fundamental rights to data protection and also to other rights. So it's important to respect these rights. And people will only accept a wide share of sharing of data and also of their personal data when they trust in the fact that these standards are fully respected and always implemented. And I think that the GDPR brings many possibilities to do what is necessary in order to also process personal data in a wide range of possibilities by respecting these fundamental rights.
Thank you, Jan. Indeed, I think everybody is also looking forward to delineating the boundaries more between personal data and other information. And obviously, there are already pending court cases and hopefully also guidelines from the European Data Protection Board forthcoming. So let's see about that. Another angle, maybe, Jan, with the new commission having appointed an executive vice president for tech sovereignty, security and democracy, how do you perceive the impact of digital sovereignty on the evolution of personal data protection? Is it feasible for the EU to attain digital autonomy while still upholding our data protection standards?
I think both comes together somehow, because digital autonomy for the European Union or sovereignty is the precondition for assuring the implementation of legal principles and constitutional frameworks also in the digital environment. So we won't be able to assure our set of rules, not only on privacy and data protection, but also on intellectual property, on democratic and rule of law principles, even in a digital society, if we don't know where processing in the end takes place and which legal system applies to the processing of digital services and data. So it is important to be aware of it, to understand what we need to do structurally to assure that our legal principles, our jurisdiction applies to those areas which we find important and necessary to be under our legal frameworks. There might be areas where this is not so important, where we compromise with the fact that there is other regions in the world setting their own standards, but we should define certain fields where we think that we should be sure about the fact that our jurisdiction applies. And that means that we also in our infrastructure, our digital infrastructure, but generally in the whole public services infrastructure, in the way how we also advise companies and industry and how they have to deal with certain security principles, for example, we have to be sure that there in those certain areas our jurisdiction applies, and we have to set the right institutions, the right infrastructure to assure this sovereignty and autonomy. And that's not easy today. It requires an in-depth look at our institutions and our infrastructure, and it requires that we also value sovereignty, that just buying the cheapest solution or the most convenient solution when it comes to hard or software, for example, may not be the right decision to safeguard not only our sovereignty in digital form, but our sovereignty in general, so that we stay democratic states still in this world society.
Thank you, Jan. Indeed, it also, as you said, it requires political will, sometimes also to change certain business models. Now, Jan, let's head into the future. I'm going to hand you over now a crystal ball, and I will be asking you, if you consider the next 10 to 20 years, what are the main trends and evolutions of our digital societies that you would anticipate?
My perception at the moment is that we have to discuss a lot about our public space, which we have today, because it is obvious that media and public space has changed a lot throughout the last 10 to 20 years. And that today we have completely different circumstances for the public discussion. And we should really be aware of the fact that the room for open marketplaces, for example, is getting smaller. And that just shows the example of Elon Musk and his platform X, which he says is the market square of today. But in fact, in Europe at least, until today, market squares haven't been owned by private entities, but have been owned by the public. And until now in Europe, when I enter the public space of the marketplace or also the roads, I don't have to ask anyone to do that. I don't have to sign up for anything. And if anyone has a problem with me, then the one who decides if it is a problem or if rules are applying is the state and public authorities, and not private entities having their own partly arbitrary, at least intransparent rules and acts. And this is a discussion which we need to have with regard to the digital society. We're giving our democratic space and our independent media out of hand, and we need to be very careful of that. And that also implies, of course, the question, but which values and which morals do we want to apply for the future society? And who is discussing this? And who is defining it? And that seems to be important, in particular with regard to the development of new technologies like artificial intelligence, because it's not anymore like those people who are into public space and very known and near to politics who develop these new technologies, but it's like developers, it's programmers, it's even sometimes the machine itself which develops the infrastructure of tomorrow. So how do we implement ethics, moral, and values? That will be the core debate besides the one on the public space, which we have to take with new technology.
Great. So many things to work on in the future. Thank you very much for that. And Jan, that brings us to the end of today's episode. We've discussed various perspectives on data privacy topics. You've shed light on your importance you bring on the personal sphere, but you've also highlighted how personal data and personal data protection is important for society. You've also sketched out some areas where the GDPR may be required to do a bit more work, where you can have more provisions in the GDPR to be explored, further harmonization even. I think you made a very good point indeed on the differentiation which is necessary between personal data and other information, which may be just as relevant for development of our societies and technologies. And of course, the concepts of digital sovereignty are getting more important. And I thank you for your fascinating insights onto the hopefully positive discussion we will have on the future public spaces. So it was an honor having you here today, Mr. Albrecht. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas.
We hope these insights gave you a fresh perspective on privacy and data protection. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to catch up on previous interviews and follow the EDPS on our channels to discover more about our projects marking the 20th anniversary of the European Data Protection Supervisor. I am Thomas Zerdig, and this was the EDPS Talk with Jan Philipp Albrecht, co-president of the Berlin-based Heinrich Böll Foundation. See you in our next talk.